Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And this weekend perspective, like I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dive into 5 storylines that may or may not get the biggest headlines for the second half of the year. But I think 5 storylines that will have a significant sort of shaping on what the second half of 2024 will look like. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right into those. Go ahead and get into those right now. First on the list is, there's starting to see, and we've been talking about this somewhat this year, but interesting article in Business Insider this past week. A number of VCs are starting to wonder about their role. And, as we talked about a lot on this show, venture capital is, a huge driver of, kind of innovation, not the innovation itself, but kind of fueling the innovation once ideas get started, companies get started, and so forth. And we're starting to see a lot of VCs over the last year or so who really kind of doubled down on AI. Obviously, we had the pandemic. We had a lot of growth at the early part of the pandemic. A lot of funding went into that. We had a lot of sort of unicorns out of 2021. A lot of that didn't necessarily pan out. Probably with some concern on the VC side, but they were still in this sort of ZIRP or zero interest rate money period. So they were able to get money at a very, very low rate. Obviously, rates have gone up as the pandemic is sort of closed out around the year, or closed out around the world. We've seen interest rates rise around the world. We've seen some inflation in places. Obviously makes it more difficult to just sort of bet on everything, which was really going on late 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. But AI came along and kind of gave venture capital a reprieve in terms of, here's the next big thing to bet on. And we saw tons and tons of money flow into that. And what we really haven't seen is a lot of exits, a lot of validation of some of that money going into it. And obviously we've seen, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago on the show, a lot of concern from VC across the board in terms of, are they going to have the opportunity, especially in the AI space, to really compete against, a lot of folks are calling it sort of little tech these days, which I think is sort of a funny name, but, sort of startups being able to compete against some of the really big players in the cloud space, especially those that, have huge billion to billion, multi-billion dollar, tens of billion, hundreds of $billion investments in that space. So, we're starting to see a lot of concern on the VC side, mostly for themselves. But, it will be interesting to sort of watch, do we start to see some signaling in terms of VC either not being able to raise funding or starting to pull back from being as aggressive as they've been over the last couple of years. I think the numbers out of that Business Insider article that I saw was only about half of the funding that they had generated or put into the system this year versus last year. So something to kind of keep an eye on as we always try and follow the money around the industry. The second thing that sort of follows along with that is, whether or not we start to see, some change in the landscape as far as, kind of the exits for companies, for especially in this case, AI related companies. So we're seeing this interesting phenomenon going on, and we mentioned it in the Cloud News of the Week. Brandon talked about it a little bit. I think we've mentioned a little bit on shows, but we're starting to see it a little bit more. In the past, you would have, companies, startup companies would go out into the world, take VC funding. In some cases, they were successful and they could take their, company public through an IPO. In many cases, they would struggle, to maybe necessarily reach sort of escape velocity or IPO level growth on their own, and oftentimes would get acquired by a larger company, right? And what we're seeing, at least in the U.S. In particular, obviously the U.S. being the largest market in terms of VC and so forth, and this is the second item on the list, the second story to sort of watch, is we've seen from from the Biden administration in particular, kind of a push from what's called the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission that looks at when acquisitions happen, kind of a big push on not allowing the largest companies to make acquisitions that continue to increase their strength in the marketplace, right? Trying to prevent sort of antitrust like pushback on acquisitions. And so one of the things that we've seen, and we mentioned it again on Cloud News of the Week this last couple weeks ago, or this week or so ago, we've seen a number of companies who were kind of visible, prominent early startups, very AI startups, very visible, founding team, former members of OpenAI or former members of Google Brain or Google, Google Mind and so forth, that had gone off and started companies. And we've seen them not really get acquired per se by Amazon or Meta or by OpenAI or Google or others, but we've seen them sort of get acqui-hired, if you will, and sort of weird acqui-hires that feel like they're trying to avoid being formal acquisitions, and are these sort of, the people all go work for something, and there's some interesting kind of things that are taken care of on the back end in terms of making sure that the investors aren't completely wiped out. And it feels like they're trying to sort of sidestep what would be the normal acquisition process in order to avoid concerns about antitrust regulation or antitrust pushback from the DOJ or the FTC in the United States of allowing those types of acquisitions to happen. So it will be very interesting, as the election evolves into September, October, November. It probably won't be a top line issue. Obviously, usually the economy is a big thing, sort of human, personal freedoms and, just kind of general direction of where the election is going. But it does feel like it will be interesting to see whether, whichever new administration comes into play, because it will be a new administration, whether it's Democrat or Republican, how they signal that their DOJ and their FTC is going to look at business, and whether or not they're going to allow more and more acquisitions to happen, especially in the tech space, or whether or not they're going to continue to be sort of hardline and we see kind of alternative ways of exit velocity for startups happening. And so I put those two together in terms of whether VC capital will continue to flow into this space, and whether there will be sort of new rules written or the same rules in play in terms of can those companies that are VC funded get acquired by some of the larger companies? And again, they don't all have to be acquired by an Amazon or Google or Facebook or whatever, but will they allow sort of any acquisitions, and especially in the tech space, of larger size to happen? And obviously we've seen some, but it'll be interesting to see if that becomes an issue as we get closer to the election. Whether tech tries to sort of throw their weight around, or whether or not they say, look, this is not the right time. We're going to wait out 2024 and get into 2025 and try and influence policy and influence direction that way. So that's sort of the second one. I think that goes pretty closely with the first one. The third one I've got on my list, and we'll get to the AI ones first, and then we'll kind of get into the non-AI ones. Third one I have on my list is kind of a curiosity. We saw a lot of interesting things demonstrated, or at least promised, in the first half of the year, whether it was new stuff from OpenAI, all sorts of interesting things that were sort of promised, with one of the latest versions of ChatGPT in terms of multimodal and language and vision and all sorts of things. We've seen various things, kind of promised through things like Google Gemini. We've seen IBM announce some things that are waiting to go GA. We've seen this from a lot. We've heard some rumors of Amazon working on some projects internally. But it'll be very interesting to see in the second half of the year, and how late into the second half of the year some of those things start to become reality, and people actually can start using them, because it does feel like a lot of things were kind of pre-announced, pre-launched. And I only bring this up because for a little period of time there, we went from the tech industry doing what they've done for many, many years, which is sort of pre-announce things, show you a demonstration of something, and then it was a good long period of time before those things were available, right? Sometimes it was 6 months, sometimes it's a year. But anytime you were going to have your big trade show, you always wanted to demonstrate something. And what we were seeing, at least in the early days of some of the AI stuff, generative AI stuff, was so much of it was, we're going to show it to you and you can get your hands on it like immediately. And that was really, really exciting, because it allowed people to get excited about something, see the possibilities of something. And then, over a weekend, we were seeing all this sort of interesting ideas, interesting innovation, new things starting to pop up and so forth. And it does feel a little bit, and this is, what something to kind of keep an eye on. It does feel a little bit like AI and the possibilities of what's coming with AI is slipping a little bit into kind of the traditional way that technology gets released, which is like released with a big bang, released with a really compelling demonstration, and then some long period of time before that's actually available to people. It's it's sort of, they did everything they could to make the demo for the keynote really cool, but that technology wasn't really available. It wasn't really ready for prime time. It wasn't ready to scale. It wasn't ready for even a beta or whatever it might be. So it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on. Apple had a lot of interesting announcements. Will those come out towards the end of the year when they usually try and ship new phones? When does all the cool OpenAI stuff sort of happen? When do some of the new Gemini features come out? Does Amazon have anything up their sleeve that'll be readily available around the time of reInvent, which is usually after Thanksgiving and so forth? It's going to be very interesting to see what the second half of the year looks like in terms of, are we still waiting for a lot of this interesting capabilities, or does the second half of the year kind of produce the actual availability in the public domain at scale for people to start really kind of expanding what you can do with AI and generative AI? So that's number 3. The fourth one I've got on my list sort of drifts back into this sort of cloud space, and we covered this briefly on the Cloud News of the Week for kind of the Q2 earnings for all the cloud providers. And the Q2 earnings were fine. Google, I think Google was probably up. They were up like 29%. Microsoft was up 31%, although apparently they were slightly short of their numbers. Google, I think, reached $10 billion for the first time. And then AWS was up 19%. And what was interesting to me about those was not that, they, made their numbers or slightly missed their numbers or whatever those are sort of always forecast nuances. But what I was kind of interested in was there's a lot of money, and they won't break this stuff out necessarily, I guess, unless you're a really, in-depth analyst that has access to, better access to the numbers than most of us get in a public domain. But we know there's a lot of money that's being spent by the cloud providers on sort of their pet projects, right? And I don't mean that like, Google is buying GPUs to be able to enhance their, search generated answers that are, Gen AI driven for Google search. I mean, like when Amazon invests $4 billion in Anthropic, and that money has to then be spent on AWS, or Google puts more money into OpenAI, or one of the other sort of acqui-hires that they put in. How much of the revenue numbers that they're announcing right now, essentially the last quarter, next quarter, or so forth, are money that's coming from sort of the investment arm of the business and being spent into the cloud side of the business to sort of prop up those numbers? And then, how much of it is actual end user usage versus, sort of them making their own investment into specific things that are training models, but aren't really, turning into fruition at this point in time. And it felt a little bit, and I don't know for sure. And again, this is just sort of speculation on my part. I wish we had, better access to the granularity of the numbers, but like how much of this quarter's numbers or last quarter's numbers or the next quarter's numbers are kind of moving money from one pocket in the large companies into the cloud providers sort of numbers, but aren't necessarily like driving end user business per se, right? So how much of like that $4 billion that AWS is putting into Anthropic is turning into Anthropic, making revenue numbers that are, whether they're profitable or not, they're driving revenue numbers. So I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch as to, how much of the cloud providers' growth numbers over the last quarter, this quarter, next quarter, and so forth are driven by, them pumping money into sort of AI model building versus them seeing that model building turn into something that is revenue generating at an end user or at a customer level. So I think that's sort of my number 4. We'll see a little more of that over the next couple of quarters. And then the last one is really, kind of getting out of the cloud and back into sort of traditional software, enterprise software, is really looking at, will any of the alternatives to VMware start to show progress in displacing the virtualization leader, right? We're now, we're now 6-7 months into, people really having a sense of what Broadcom is intended to do with VMware. Broadcom has, announced their plans. They've sort of laid out which customers are the most important to them. They've laid out different models in which they are working with or not working with what used to be their traditional partner ecosystem, their partner channels, their systems integrator channels. They have, laid out where their price increases look like, where their new bundling looks like, where their pricing looks like, and so forth. So that's pretty well understood by people. Lots of customers are getting their new bills, or they're getting a view of what their future, VMware Broadcom spend will have to look like. And we've seen speculation of it being 2x, 3x, 5x, in some cases 7 or 8x. Again, kind of depends on the customer, depends on what they were buying, how they were buying, how much of the bundles they were buying versus individual products. But I think it'll be very, very interesting, now that we are, getting into 7, 8, 9 months of, awareness of this. Customers have had a chance to kind of digest it. They've had a chance to figure out, okay, how tolerant am I going to be of what the new VMware looks like in the context of Broadcom, and do we start to see, some movement? Do we start to see companies saying, "No, I'm not going to put up with this. I'm going to move away from VMware"? Do we see one of the companies that are out there attempting to do this, whether it is Nutanix or Red Hat or the cloud providers with their virtualization solutions like Microsoft and others? Do they start to see some traction? Do they start to announce numbers? Do they start to announce customers? I think it's going to be very interesting to see if they can get that ball rolling. How much they announce publicly? How much are those customers willing to talk about their interest in migrating to something else? Because I think this is going to be something that right now we know there is frustration in the marketplace. We've seen it on various forums and we've seen it floating around. But do we start to see momentum of a big bank, a couple of big companies, a big 3 or 4 big companies, 5 or 6 big companies, some big announcement happen, where companies are saying, look, we are committed to moving away from VMware. So I think that's going to be very big. I think VMworld is coming up here in a couple of weeks. It'll be interesting to see the tone that they try and portray. How much of it is kind of what VMware used to do, which was all around sort of innovation and big architectures, or what's the new message that's coming out of Broadcom VMware. So that's my number 5 item on the list. I think between those 5 things, so going back on them, VCs and capital moving into markets, especially around AI startups, the number 2 and number 3 kind of tying together, whether or not we see antitrust and the ability for startups to sort of get sold off to larger companies. 1 and 2, VCs and antitrust kind of being tied together. Number 3, do we start to see some usage of these interesting AI demos become reality? Number 4, do we see, better understanding of how the hyperscalers are, actually making money on AI versus just churning through GPUs? Is it turning into actual applications that are generating revenue for the people that are using it? And then number 5, what's the latest with Broadcom and VMware? Are we starting to see migrations, or are people doubling down on kind of just living with what the new VMware Broadcom looks like? So all 5 of those I think are interesting to kind of keep an eye on for the second half of the year. May not be the highest visibility sort of headlines, but I think they're things that touch enough around the economics of our industry, the sort of bigger players in our industry, and some of the major shifts that we're seeing in our industry, whether it's around AI or virtualization or cloud provider revenue, and where they're growing and where they're not growing. So anyways, with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. Another Weekend Perspective. I am going to be traveling quite a bit the next week and a half, so I'm hoping to be able to get the shows out. We may miss a Weekend Perspective just depending on. I've got a lot of travel in the next week or so. I know Aaron has been a little bit under the weather, so we're going to do the best we can. The Wednesday shows should be fine. We pre-record some of those ahead of time. Weekend Perspectives, we'll see. So with that, I'll wrap it up. I'll talk to you next week.